Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. Welcome back to the Center for Security Policy for our webinar series. We were on a summer hiatus, but we decided to hold this special webinar to address the ongoing crisis in Afghanistan caused by President Biden's abrupt order to withdraw U.S. troops. This panel will examine the causes of this debacle and its implications for U.S. national security. We'll resume our regularly scheduled webinars after Labor Day. For today's program, we welcome our guest from the Hudson Institute, Robert Greenway, as well as the Center's own director for the Middle East and North Africa, Victoria Coates. Our president and CEO, Fred Fleitz, will moderate. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box in your GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many questions as possible at the end of the program. This event is being simulcast on C-SPAN and will be recorded and made available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and via our website at securefreedom.org. With that, I'll hand it to our president, Fred Fleitz.
Adam, thank you, and I'd like to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today. Americans in the world were stunned at how fast Afghanistan fell to the Taliban after U.S. troops pulled out. Now, President Biden is claiming that this is because of the weakness of the Afghan army and because he was handed a plan from President Trump. His critics are saying he pulled out too quickly, that he had a withdrawal there was no plan at all, that he didn't consult with the Afghan government, with the Afghan military, with our allies. And we've been horrified at the result, no matter who was responsible. So we're going to talk today with this extraordinary panel. I just want to tell you a little bit about my two fellow co-panelists. Robert Greenway is an adjunct fellow at the Hudson Institute and served as a deputy assistant to the president and senior director for the Middle East and North Africa in the Trump National Security Council. Rob also had a distinguished career as an Army officer and served 3 tours in Afghanistan. And this included an operations officer for a special mission in 2001, special intelligence advisor to the Deputy Chief of Staff for Intelligence, and senior intelligence advisor to the Commander, International Security Assistance Force in 2011, and senior intelligence advisor to the Commander of Combined Special Operations Task Force Afghanistan, NATO, and the NATO Joint Special Operations Component Command Afghanistan in 2014 and 2015. Rob, thank you for your service and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Fred. Appreciate the opportunity to join you and Victoria today to talk about a subject I know that is of great interest to many. I'll make a couple of quick points.
Rob, I want to introduce Victoria first before I let you go on, and then I'll get to you. Our other guest works for the Center for Security Policy, Dr. Victoria Coates. As Adam said, she is director of our Center on the Middle East and North Africa. She also was a deputy national security advisor and senior director for the Middle East and North Africa in the Trump National Security Council. She was a senior policy advisor to Department of Energy Secretary Dan Berlet after her NSC assignment. And prior to that, she was a senior national security advisor to Senator Ted Cruz. Victoria, welcome.
Thank you, Fred.
So Rob, Rob and Victoria, I want to start with both of you by just saying, tell us how this crisis we're seeing in Afghanistan, particularly in Kabul, happened. What did President Biden do wrong? What did he do right? How do we get to where we are? And Rob, why don't you start?
Sure. Thanks, Fred, and thanks for having me today. So look, I think in the end, this was predictable. Most analysts have come out, I think, in the last couple of days and talked about how this was not a surprise. Those with significant time and experience on the ground recognized that rapid collapse was certainly possible, if not probable. And I think the actions taken in the last 6 months have accelerated that. As you mentioned, little coordination with our allies, little coordination with our partners on the ground, and a withdrawal of appreciable support. Air support gets a lot of attention. That's vital. Maintenance, obviously, is another component of that. Pay and logistical support in general was denied our partners and allies, and that, of course, erodes their capacity to fight. And of course, their government provided very little. The Afghan government provided very little inspiration, motivation, purpose, and direction for their armed forces. And that historically has been a problem without U.S. assistance. And so I think it's not a surprise this occurred. I think what is a surprise is the way in which we failed to respond to this effectively. We removed our infrastructure. We began this entire process at the beginning of the fighting season, as opposed to at the end of it or over the winter interregnum. And I think as we withdrew all enablers and our support, both morally and physically, it provided an atmosphere in which you're likely to see compromise made by the Afghan security forces, and with very few exceptions. That's exactly what transpired. Unfortunately, as we know, this was completely preventable, because just 6 months ago, we were down to 2,500 troops on the ground and enablers in the form of civilian contractors. And that was sufficient to hold all of the provincial headquarters. And again, the withdrawal, I think, now demonstrated what was, again, unfortunately, quite preventable. Unfortunately, also, I think we're going to experience a great deal of pain as a result of this decision, because now we're left, of course, with the world's largest terrorist organization, now among its best equipped, in uncontested control of a country the size of Texas, with 60 to 80% of the world's opium supply. And of course, we can't forget that this organization is Al-Qaeda's best friend, longest friend, and their landlord up until recently. So there's going to be significant implications, and I'm sure today we'll get the chance to talk about it.
Victoria?
Well, thanks, Fred, and Rob, thanks so much for doing this. I obviously have benefited greatly from your experience and expertise, and continue to do so, and I appreciate your joining us at CSP for this discussion today. You know, as I've been pondering this, one thing that is, I guess, to some extent encouraging is that I've spoken to both former and current members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, both Democrat and Republican, over the last 36 hours, and all of them are just asking, how do we make this better? I think there's a real sense of shock across the USG, and for people who are actually implementing policy, a desire to get to a better place. And I think the catastrophic breakdown that we saw in late July and early August in any kind of orderly policy process will certainly be addressed. I think there are going to be investigations galore going on into this. But my real focus right now, I can't fix the last 8 weeks, but can I do something about the next 8 weeks? And I think as we look at that, there are a couple of realities we have to confront. One is that there was no good answer. There are a lot of people who are suddenly saying, oh, you know, here's what we could have done. It all would have been better. If there were a good answer for Afghanistan, somebody would have found it over the course of the last 20 years. There was going to be some kind of compromise. It was going to be imperfect. But I do not think we faced a binary choice between the debacle we're going through now and 100,000 US troops on the ground again. As Rob said, we were doing a pretty manageable job with 2,500. So there was another option, and figuring out going forward, if we still have any options, I think should be of critical importance to us. I think we also need to encourage everybody to be thinking beyond the immediate task at hand. It was very disheartening to hear the White House spokesperson yesterday say that they weren't even going to address any questions of what happens after September 1st because they're solely focused on the crisis at hand, I believe was her phrase. And of course, that's enormously important. And there are a lot of people in Kabul who are doing everything they can to mitigate that crisis. But there are going to be Americans in Afghanistan after September 1st. There are going to be Afghan citizens who are threatened by the Taliban after September 1st. And of course, we're barreling toward the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. The Taliban are signaling they want to foot stomp this. You know, what's going on to prepare for that? And then as we go into the fall and the winter, what are the planning processes in place? And so I think that's something we should all focus on. Two quick last points that I wanted to make about how this is different than it was 20 years ago that have become, that are striking to me over the last few days watching the footage. The first is that the Taliban appear to have discovered the art of public relations during their 20-year hiatus. And the theme that I'm discerning from their performances is that this is not your father's Taliban. And they're being interviewed by women journalists, which is getting fawning coverage in the US press. Oh my gosh, it must be different. They're saying that that women will have a role in the new Afghan government, of course, with the caveat that this role will be consistent with Sharia law. So if you know anything about Sharia law, you can see where that's headed. But that's what they're saying. And I think their effort to present themselves as the legitimate, indeed desired government of Afghanistan, and that kind of performance they put on in Kabul is going to be enormously important, and we need to watch it very, very closely, and we need to make sure that we are matching up their deeds with their words. And that brings me to my second point, which is something Rob and I have both worked on, which is making sure the people of Afghanistan outside the capital city have communications, can get their word out. I was very struck this morning by a guest on a U.S. cable morning show calling in from Kabul with his, cell phone camera and giving an interview. 20 years ago, that wasn't possible. And in Kabul, you have a stable enough internet platform for somebody to be able to do that and get their voice out there. That Taliban couldn't stifle that this morning, although there were some interesting kind of breaks in the feed. But you then have the vast majority of the country which does not have that kind of stable internet supply. And so one thing I would toss out there, which is worth every cent that they paid for it, for the new administration, which is you have the capacity to provide surge internet connectivity, even in areas where a government's trying to tamp it down. This is new technology. People may have heard about the Starlink network that SpaceX is launching. That's one possibility. There are others. But I think if we have a promising policy recommendation going forward, it's to give the Afghan people a voice so that they don't feel like their only choice is the Taliban. They can get what's happening in the provinces, because that's where we're starting to hear about the murders, the indiscriminate firing on protesters, the women who are being abused. We're starting to hear inklings of this, but one of the advantages of 21st century technology is that can be very immediately brought to everyone's attention, to the attention of the United Nations, to the attention of the United States government and those of our allies, and to those who want to help the people of Afghanistan and not just consign them to this medieval style theocracy. So those were the main points I wanted to make, Fred, and I'd be very happy to answer any of your questions.
Well, Rob, I want to turn to you, and I want to ask specifically about what President Biden said. He blamed basically the main reason that Kabul fell so quickly, the country fell so quickly. He blamed the Afghan military. Now, you work with the Afghan military. Now, there were predictions that it would take 6 months, maybe up to 18 months for the Taliban to take over, but that didn't happen. So could you comment on the president's justification for what happened? Is this accurate? What really happened?
So thanks and appreciate the question. Look, I'd say first that it's probably a bit of a misdirection to blame someone else for securing your national security objectives, right? So it may not go without saying that if we have an interest in Afghanistan, I'd argue that we did, and we continue to have one, that we should take responsibility for it. Now, we have long labored to establish a partner on the ground in the Afghan security forces, from an intelligence, from a police, and also from a military standpoint. And I think we've made some strides in doing it, but also it's been an imperfect process. In some cases, we've been attempting to mirror image ourselves in the creation of the Afghan army. But look, at the end of the day, this force faced a decision. It saw the erosion of U.S. support. It saw a lack of commitment and effective leadership from its own government. And at the same time, it saw increasing recognition and support for the Taliban. And in that equation, many of them were forced to broker into their own negotiations. They saw the peace talks happening very publicly in Doha, and I think they decided to undertake the same process in their each respective regions. And I think the Taliban made the most of it. And I'm sure that the argument was similar to, you have no support and assistance. You're not going to be supported by the United States. You're not being supported by your headquarters and your government in Kabul. We're it. And ultimately, I think that threat of force probably was compelling and almost certainly contributed to the widespread collapse. I'll also say, though, that this is not probably going to be an enduring circumstance. This is not going to be a widespread situation where the Taliban are able to control the entirety of their country for very long. I suspect that very quickly we're going to see, not just in Panjshir, we're going to see lots of resistance popping up in small, disparate ways. The question is, what do we do? Do we support these groups in opposing the Taliban or not? And I think our leadership on this question is going to be central, and it's going to come to us very quickly. At the end of the day, look, it's not surprising the Afghan military was not up to it. But I would also say that they have been for the last 20 years while we've been providing support and assistance. And up until recently, with just as few of 2,500 uniformed service members in country, we were able to hold off the Taliban with the Afghan security forces, who since really 2014 have borne the cost of this conflict with their own blood. Some 66,000 have perished in the conflict, far more than we have shed in terms of losses. The casualties have been far higher than that. So look, I think we made strides in creating a viable security force. It was not capable of operating without assistance. When we pulled that assistance, I think they found cause to cave in. I do think, though, that we're going to see elements of that organization resurrect itself in opposition to the Taliban in the coming weeks.
Victoria, how do you think the recent events in Afghanistan are going to affect American influence and ability to get things done on the world stage? Now, I'm particularly thinking of the Middle East and with China.
That is going to be one of the most profound questions going forward, and certainly we're seeing our friends in the PRC capitalize as much as they can as quickly as possible on what they see as a public relations bonanza for them about the unreliability and fecklessness of the United States. And there's no getting around the fact that we handed them that card. This was a total unforced error that didn't have to be and was entirely predictable. Now, the good news on this front is that if one looks around the world more seriously, from Germany to Japan to South Korea, you see that the United States commitment is enduring and that we are the partner of choice. One thing I found very striking in the news this week is the announcement that Vice President Harris will be visiting Vietnam in the coming days or weeks. And she will be the first United States vice president to visit Vietnam since Hubert Humphrey paid a 1 hour visit to Saigon in 1966. And so that is a remarkable trajectory. That's 55 years later, you have a sitting American vice president visit the capital of Vietnam. And obviously the comparisons between the fall of Kabul and the fall of Saigon have been turned into something of a cottage industry. I have my own contribution to that industry, but I think that trajectory ultimately is a hopeful one. And it's a shame that we've set it back so far and might take 50 years to achieve. But the good news is that the people of Vietnam, and perhaps the people of Afghanistan after them, wake up to the fact that the United States is the partner of choice. But for the moment, we have really set that back, unfortunately. And there are so many things that we could have focused on. And of course, hindsight is 2020. But one topic that's getting a ton of attention is the rare earth mineral deposits in Afghanistan that China is particularly keen on controlling. I think that could have been a very persuasive argument to the American people who are waking up through the disruptions in the supply chain to the importance of these resources, that this is what we're going to go in and control. This is why we're here. That is a very practical answer to the question that we've had so much trouble answering, after the immediate threat of 9/11 was disrupted. So I think this is a deeply unfortunate event. I think it will invite more aggression from China. Everyone's looking at Taiwan. That's certainly not the only place they're going to flex muscle. And unfortunately, if we're looking to the Vietnam example, of course, 2 weeks after the fall of Saigon, we had the Mayaguez crisis, almost went to war with Khmer Rouge. And then we had the Soviets invade Afghanistan. We had the Iranian Revolution and hostage crisis. These tend to be the kinds of responses to perceived American weakness or inattention. And I think that's what we're all going to have to be deeply mindful of in coming years and watch out and do what we can to mitigate these risks.
Rob, I want to ask you about the security of the Kabul airport and these 4,000 to 5,000 additional troops that President Biden was forced to send in to get Americans out and Afghans who helped him. What is the security situation there? What are these troops supposed to be doing? And how are they going to get all these people out?
Yeah, and first, a great deal of respect for those that are on the ground performing this mission under one of the most challenging circumstances imaginable. This is where, in crisis, you get to see the strength of our own forces and what they're capable of doing logistically and from a military standpoint. Look, I think we had no question, but that we had to establish an air bridge. I think it's been discussed that maintaining Bagram, which is just some 25 miles north of Kabul, would have been an advantage had we retained possession of it. I'm inclined to think that that's certainly true. In this case, we had very few options. You've got a civilian and military side of what is now called Hamid Karzai International Airport, and our own international joint coalition forces were headquartered there for a number of years. We've always had that presence. The job now is to maintain security over the military side of the airfield and to establish control of the air traffic control pattern so that we can resume military and civilian flights. As I understand it now, as of this morning, both have resumed, but the unfortunate reality is the Taliban maintain the outer security of the perimeter of Kabul airport, which is just to the north of the city. And as a result, there are still enormous challenges getting through Taliban checkpoints, which is, again, not a surprise. So how many are able to make it to our secure perimeter in order to be evacuated? And the answer seems to be not nearly enough. And again, I don't think that's a function now of our forces on the ground. I think it's a question now of the fact that the situation prevents our individuals, both the SIV applicants and others, from getting there. And in fact, American citizens, which now number upwards of between 10 and 15,000, I think, are the estimates that are being used by the administration. And you have to wonder how many are not able to get to the airport, but how many are not even in Kabul? And what is the plan? And so I think that exposes the fact that this is not something that we were well postured in order to execute. So I think now we've got a military presence capable of, for the moment, securing the airfield, but only for those that are able to make it to the airfield. I think you've got civilian air flights that are in many cases leaving below capacity now, which is unfortunate given the need. But to me, the ultimate...
I want to interrupt you for a minute just to talk about that. The Dutch flew in a plane yesterday. It left empty today. The Germans flew in a plane. It had 7 people. There's an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 Americans in Kabul who can't get to the airport. What is going to be done to address this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one without the introduction of additional forces, it's hard to envision anything beyond negotiating with the Taliban, which again, I think is theater and also self-deceiving. Look, I'm concerned that we're going to have a hard time doing it. I'm also concerned that the situation we have now is not going to last. I think this sort of stasis where we're in default cooperation with the Taliban from a security perspective is not going to last. Not just because the Taliban don't want it, but because they don't have control over all of their forces either. So the odds of this situation being rapidly upended by some escalatory event, frankly, I'm surprised it hasn't happened already, which then begs the question of what do we do in response? So your question's valid. I don't see evidence of a plan in order to introduce additional forces to be able to expand our security perimeter. And I don't know how we negotiate with the Taliban, but I'm concerned that we would concede all measure of funds and external support in order to get their compliance, which gets to a really dangerous trajectory where we're providing additional material support beyond the $83 billion of equipment they're now in possession of.
Victoria, what are your thoughts on the security situation in Kabul and the Kabul airport? And I might add, I saw someone on the internet, someone I know, a national security expert, saying we should try to take back Bagram Air Base. That's a terrible idea. That's not going to happen. But what are your thoughts on this security disaster in Kabul?
Yeah, and I mean, Bagram is a very interesting example. I tend to share Rob's views on the desirability of not giving it up in the first place. I understand where you are on any attempt to take it back at this point. You know, I don't think we can stuff the genie back into that particular bottle, but the enormous value of that base, so a huge taxpayer investment in it, and how very desirable it would be right now to have what's essentially a small city where we can house the American citizens, the at-risk Afghans, and 2 runways that we control, hopefully is starkly clear to everyone. And another person to whom I think that would have been starkly clear would have been President Trump. You know, there are a lot of kind of armchair quarterbacking going on right now about what he might or might not have done on Afghanistan in the first 7 months, rather, of his second term. We'll never know that. But one thing Rob and I both know, because we were with him, serving with you at the time, Fred, was at Christmas of 18, we went to Iraq with President Trump and flew into Al-Assad Air Base. And he grasped the significance of that asset immediately. And it was one of the key takeaways for him from that trip was the scale and the significance of U.S. assets in the region that would allow us to move people and material in and out quickly on our own terms, unbeholden to whatever government is in Kabul or Baghdad. And I think relinquishing that, just offering it up. And the one other thing I wanted to say about Bagram, because I think this does go to the security situation, is the way in which we did it, basically departing in the dark of night. So our Afghan partners come in to work the next day and there's nobody there. And they've got equipment they can't maintain at a facility they can't fully operate. I think that was such a demoralizing moment. Such a public demonstration of a lack of concern with them. And I understand there could be force protection issues that might prompt you to take that course, but there were ways that could have been mitigated so that they felt reassured, they felt prepared. And I wonder if in hindsight, when we're going back and writing the histories of the period, that's when the majority of the Afghans made the decision that they had no alternative but the Taliban, that it had been so clearly demonstrated to them that the US was gone. And then General Milley is saying publicly, there's no tactical need for Bagram. Well, clearly that wasn't correct. And I think that was one of the great destabilizing decisions that led to the security situation we see now.
Rob, there's already an Al-Qaeda and ISIS presence in Afghanistan, and some experts are thinking that terrorist groups like this, radical Islamists, are going to stream into the country. Maybe Al-Qaeda members who have been holed up in Tehran since the U.S. invasion. Do you expect the Taliban is going to allow that to happen, to allow their country to again become a terrorist safe haven?
So this is the unfortunate irony, is that never stopped. There was never a point in time that I'm aware that they did not provide access to Al-Qaeda for the entirety of the conflict. As long as the Taliban were operating in an area, Al-Qaeda's expertise was welcome. There are some areas where this prevailed over others. The eastern and southern portions of Afghanistan, the northeastern portion in particular, became a sanctuary and safe haven and a base of operations for Al-Qaeda during the present conflict. So this was never not the case. I'll also say that all of the prisons that have just been emptied, for which we have been laboring to fill for some 20 years with the worst of the worst, at great expense and risk to our personnel operationally, and Afghans as well, by the way, have all now just been poured back into the bloodstream. And I don't know how long it's going to take for us to do this. Now, I'd remind you that we're keeping some 900 personnel in Syria to prevent this sort of outcome, because we've made deposits of ISIS criminals in all sorts of detention facilities guarded by our partners. When the Taliban liberated Pul-e-Charkhi, Bagram prison, a whole bunch of other detention facilities, everyone's back out in general population. And not to be watched, but to be embraced. This is the same movement. I don't understand the delusion, really. And I think many have been painfully calling this to everyone's attention. This is one and the same. These organizations are not dissimilar. They share the same ideology. They've declared loyalty to one another, and they've never relinquished it. And now we're going to have to bear the consequences of it, because this is going to be the largest jihadi Disneyland that we've seen, that'll eclipse, frankly, what ISIS was able to do in Iraq and Syria.
Victoria, Iran, Russia, and China, how do you expect them to exploit the U.S. leaving Afghanistan and the Taliban taking over?
It's like lions, tigers, and bears, Fred. I think that has to be our main concern. Three of our top adversaries globally for great power competition. Again, trying in my Pollyannish way to find a silver lining, there are problems for all three in this situation as well. The Iranians closed their border today to Afghan refugees. I think they're deeply concerned about that. Certainly they're not rescuing anybody from the tender clutches of the Taliban. I think they, the Russians obviously have a history of their own in Afghanistan that might make them cautious about being too aggressive in that theater. And for China, a radical Islamic regime, up on their flank, up against that part of the country where they're enormously concerned about that, could potentially have some ramifications for them. So it's not a slam dunk from their perspective. Obviously, I think the huge advantage for them is that we're gone. They don't have to worry about us in the neighborhood from that particular theater, and that they can talk about how unreliable and feckless we are, and it's hard to argue with in this context. So I think we will have to be very, very vigilant about their activities. And I guess final point I'd make in this context: watch out for unorthodox alliances. I've heard some interesting chatter about, oh, well, the Taliban hate ISIS. Sometimes we can fight ISIS with the Taliban, and so ISIS will never have a presence in Afghanistan while the Taliban are in control. That's the same as, oh, Al-Qaeda and Iran will never align. One's Shiite, one's Sunni, they hate each other. Well, guess what? They hate us more. And so, we have seen evidence of collusion between Al-Qaeda and Iran going back quite a long time. And I would never reject out of hand the possibility that the Taliban could strike a deal with ISIS. And I guess one last point is, the key thing for me here are the resources, even more than the physical presence in Afghanistan, because again, different from 20 years ago, they can organize virtually and plot virtually. But now they are going to have much more significant resources in terms of the narco dollars, whatever assets they get their hands on, taxation, to finance these efforts. But they can be global. They don't have to be restricted to Afghanistan.
Rob, the Taliban has long had a close relationship with Pakistan, which I expect will continue under a Taliban government in Afghanistan. Do you expect there's any way we could use that relationship to influence or work with the Taliban or get Americans out, or, I don't know, achieve anything to make this bad situation less bad?
So certainly we've clung to that hope for decades now. And I think to say that they have a close relationship may be a bit of an understatement. You saw Imran Khan's public comments, which belie the feeling of many Pakistanis, because that relationship is exceedingly close. But it's also dangerous, and so it has been a very delicate proposition for them, because they know internally it presents equal measure of difficulty. And many of the folks released from prison are in Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, which is among the most dangerous threats to Pakistan's security situation. So it's a delicate issue. Can we cooperate with them? I think that the odds of that are probably, and I think because we failed to do so successfully for the last 20 years, because the Taliban enjoyed sanctuary and safe haven in Pakistan up until this very moment. And so as long as that is the case, it's very difficult. That infrastructure is old and established. I think it is not impossible to do, but I think it is unlikely under the current circumstances. I think we should approach them in order to obtain the cooperation necessary to at least liberate some of the flow of refugees across the border, however possible. Right now, that flow is going the other direction, because Pakistan wants all the Afghan refugees, including the Taliban, members of the Haqqani network and others. They want them to leave the Fatah and Baluchistan to get back into their native territory. And again, this is a risk mitigation measure. We'd have to work with them, but they'd have to see the consequences of it. And we have historically been unprepared in order to do that. Instead, we've incentivized them in order to maintain this relationship. And it has burnt us, and it will probably burn them in equal measure. For the moment, they're happy they've got a free northern flank and they can focus on India. In the long term, it's probably going to be painful for them and for us. So there are opportunities, but they're limited. I'd say Uzbekistan constitutes probably the most realistic option available to us, and we should look at our options in that regard and see what can be done.
Victoria, the U.S. recently announced that it was cutting off Afghanistan's access to its foreign reserves. I'm wondering if a lever like this will work, and are there other levers we could use to try to push the Taliban in a positive direction, or release American citizens, or maybe achieve other things that we need to do with the Taliban government?
Well, that is one of our last actual levers of control. And, you know, it again points to the existing great strengths of the United States. You know, folks aren't racing to hand their reserves over to Beijing, but are very eager to partner with the Federal Reserve. And I was pleased. I had heard from former Treasury colleagues earlier this week about efforts to get those funds frozen, to stop the provision of U.S. hard currency, which is one thing that's been stabilizing the Afghan currency. So that is a massive lever. And then there is the issue of sanctions, and the sanctions the Taliban are currently under. There is no humanitarian exception, is my understanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I don't think there is a humanitarian exception to the Taliban sanctions that they currently have. So with those funds frozen, with no avenue for humanitarian aid to go into the country, that is going to constrict some of their activities. But as I just mentioned, they have other potential sources of revenue. They actually have something of a genius for tax collection. So that's something I'm sure they'll implement, and then I'm sure they'll take firm control of the drug trade, and that of course is enormously lucrative. So it is a lever. It's probably our best one right now, but I worry it might slow them down, but it's not going to stop them.
Rob, we're seeing pictures on television of huge numbers of American weapons and vehicles that the Taliban have taken control of, especially as they took over Kabul and Bagram Air Base. Could you talk about what weapons we might be what weapons we're talking about here, and what are the implications of this terrorist group acquiring this stuff?
So happy to answer that question. Before I do, one point on to Victoria's answer to your earlier question. We have to be careful too that the leverage that we have in terms of financial access to money held at the Federal Reserve can also be used against us, because we've got vulnerable populations of American citizens, and the Taliban may in fact use that leverage against us. So we have to be cautious of ensuring we have safeguards. I'm not saying this administration is vulnerable to giving up leverage, but it's certainly a possibility. In answer to your question, look, over the past 20 years, we have spent an enormous amount of resources in order to supply and provide our Afghan partners enormous amounts. So from the small arms to artillery, to armored vehicles, to aircraft, mostly surveillance aircraft, but also transport aircraft and helicopters. And we have provided some $83 billion worth of equipment. And then we left a great deal more in the process of our withdrawal. And the infrastructure that Victoria mentioned earlier, the airfields that are shuttle capable at Bagram, in Helmand, at Kandahar, and also in the eastern portion of Afghanistan and elsewhere, is not insignificant. And so the amount of material now available to the Taliban is hard to estimate. How much of that they have functioning ability to use is a different matter. It obviously requires maintenance. I mentioned that without the ability of logistical contractors, the maintenance of aircraft in particular is difficult. It's not a strong suit for many in this part of the world. And so I think that they're going to find a lot of that to be unusable. They'll get some support and assistance from external parties, potentially Pakistan among them. But I think it's going to be a challenge for them to employ a lot of it, but they don't need to. Right? They were a problem that brought us there in September 2001. They're a greater problem now than they ever were, controlling more ground than they did at the time, and now more resources and equipment, thanks to what we provided them. And again, unfortunately, it's a hallmark of failure to prepare in order to provide the control mechanisms over all of that equipment. And I'd argue the other unfortunate aspect of this is I'm not sure they needed all of it in the first place. In many cases, we equipped them as a mechanized army to fight an insurgent force that was anything but. And so I think at the end of the day, we probably could have made better use of our resources. And so unfortunately, the Taliban now and Al-Qaeda with them are in control of one of the largest arms depots in the region.
So they could give these weapons to other terrorist groups. They could sell the aircraft to the Russians and the Chinese.
Oh, absolutely could. And some of the aircraft, of course, are Russian because that's what they had experience in operating before we arrived. And so that's absolutely true. And of course, the Iranians would have access to this equipment now as well. And you're absolutely right. And I would hasten to mention too that every terrorist that was looking for a new home after the fall of the ISIS caliphate and the difficulty in some of their franchises, now the green light is lit over Afghanistan, and the jihadis will now be once again returning. Only this time they'll be returning to significantly more infrastructure than they've ever enjoyed before, with almost no impediments. And so we have to be cautious of the fact that there is a new standard bearer among these groups, and they're going to be operating in the largest sanctuary and safe haven that, to my knowledge, has ever been established.
Well, my take on this, I wanted the U.S. to pull out of Afghanistan, but with a plan, with cooperation with our allies, with the Afghan government, with the Afghan military. But Joe Biden pulled out without a plan. He did so suddenly. He pulled the rug out from under the Afghan military. He destroyed their morale. He destroyed their ability to fight, and he seriously damaged America's reputation on the global stage. And I think our allies around the world, in Taiwan, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, I think they're worried right now at the incompetence of this president. What is going to happen if this president stays in office until the end of his term? I'm very, very worried. With that depressing statement, I'm going to invite my colleague Adam Savitt back on. And those of you who have submitted questions through the GoToWebinar console, he will read them out. And if you're not on GoToWebinar, you can still sign up and you can send a question, and Adam will ask our panel. So Adam, over to you.
Sure. Will the Biden administration officially recognize the Taliban government, and what would that relationship look like?
That's an excellent question, and I was deeply disheartened to hear National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan yesterday say that was something they were considering, that question had not been answered. He felt it was premature at this point. I mean, I think the answer needs to be that absent, a dramatic change in the Taliban spots, they cannot be seen as a legitimate government of Afghanistan, that we don't want to see them on the UN Human Rights Council. We do not wish to have to grant them visas to come to the United Nations General Assembly in September, that we don't want to have to release the Federal Reserve frozen funds. And, that to me is simply would be a declaration of strength on the part of the United States. It is difficult to see how recognition of them would work given the existing sanctions. They can revoke those sanctions. They can go through various other avenues. But if the Taliban continue to behave the way history tells us they're going to behave, then we're going to have a situation analogous to the Houthi in Yemen, when the administration took them off the foreign terrorist organization list earlier this year, only to have them break out into an extraordinary renaissance of terrorism. Not that they ever needed to be reborn, but the minute they were off the list, they expanded their activities. And it's been a real embarrassment. And there's certainly no evidence that the Houthi are going to become a responsible diplomatic partner at any point in the future. And I think that would be a real lesson learned for dealing with the Taliban.
Based on the U.S. performance in Afghanistan, is it more or less likely that the U.S. will defend Taiwan? Not the optics, but actually defending when it comes down to it.
Rob, do you want to take the first poke at that?
Yeah, happy to speculate. I think the real issue is it's called into question, and I think that doubt is being already exploited by the Chinese without surprise. And so I think both the Taiwanese and the Chinese and others in the region, frankly, are now calling into question our commitment. And it's not surprising given the events of the last few days and weeks. And I think that doubt is what we have labored to prevent for frankly, for decades. And I think as long as that doubt is being exploited, then I think that certainly calls into question. Now, in terms of the reality, certainly I think this administration, as its predecessors, have committed to defending Taiwan. But again, it's an open question, and the doubt is going to be exploited, and that doubt is going to result in tangible decisions and hedge making, and it's not going to break in our favor. And it erodes our leverage on an international level and in a regional level at precisely the time at which we need to confront China's malign behavior in the Pacific, but also across the globe. So unfortunate timing. It will be exploited, and certainly now there is doubt where previously there was at least an understanding that the U.S. meant what it said. Now, of course, many have have a reason to doubt that whether or not we're sincere in our commitments.
What does the landscape? Oh, go ahead.
The problem, this was a huge foreign policy failure for Biden, and heads have to roll. I think Biden's primarily responsible, but he needs a new national security team. Where's the Mike Pompeo or Jim Baker or Henry Kissinger on this team? There's none. It's second stringers. They don't know what they're doing. They should all be fired. There are very good Democratic experts like Jane Harman, Senator Chris Coons, others who we could come up with who have gravitas and backbone. And when Biden proposes something that is frankly bonkers, they're going to stand up to him and say, Mr. President, we can't do that. Now, that obviously didn't happen here, or if it did, President just ignored him. But there have to be people with influence to rebuild our global reputation. And the cast of characters running our national security right now, they are not up to the task. Sullivan has to go, Blinken has to go, Austin has to go, and President Biden has to put really credible people in there who I think can help rebuild our reputation on the global stage after this disaster.
What does the landscape look like when the Taliban or other tribes start kidnapping and killing Americans trapped in the interior of Afghanistan for leverage?
Well, again, that's a critical question. And I think Rob touched on it in terms of their using this as a tactic to get us to release some of their funds. I think that's an enormous danger because the Taliban are a terrorist organization. They use terrorist tactics, including public executions and hostage taking and hostage abuse. It would be certainly a remarkable surprise, one I will hope to have, but if they were not tracking very carefully vulnerable Americans throughout Afghanistan in corners where we can't see them right now and where it's very hard for them to communicate. And I think one of the things, going to Fred's point here, that we do have to address in pretty short order is the policy process breakdown. One thing Fred, Rob, and I all worked closely together and individually on in the administration was running an effective National Security Council process. And that mechanism for disseminating the president's views and guidance to all of our colleagues across the interagency, state and defense, yes, but also Treasury, energy, commerce. There are a range of different organizations that participate in that process, and making sure everybody's views are getting up to the right people. All the information is flowing through the National Security Council, which has the capacity to both review it and understand it in context, which clearly didn't happen here. We're facing so many dangers going forward, such as a massive hostage crisis in Afghanistan. I mean, if I had told you in the winter of 1978 we were facing a massive hostage crisis in Iran, it might have seemed kind of crazy. But of course, that's where we were a year later. So we can actually see this coming at us right now, and figuring out how we will both try to mitigate it by getting those people out or deal with it in the event that it happens. But we have to start that process now. And I agree with Fred, confidence in this particular group of policymakers is pretty badly shaken at this moment.
I would add one thing to that, only because it touches upon this over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability, right, which goes hand in hand with it. One, we have really withdrawn all of our intelligence resources. Second, anyone who is willing to cooperate with us in that field now has certainly probably headed to the airport or has concluded that we're untrustworthy. In any case, it's a problem. But absent eyes, the ability to see and respond. Look, those incidents you mentioned may be going on right now. We should assume they are. You have estimates of U.S. citizens, but estimates only. So it's going to be a while before we can account for U.S. citizens. I suspect the Taliban are going to be taking a great deal more attention to this and have the capacity to do it. But more importantly, the myth of being able to conduct precision counterterrorism operations from outside the country, I think, is going to be dangerously disproven, and it's not going to take long for it to happen. It's just frankly an impractical issue. And it has always been a problem behind, I think, the entire idea of evacuating our presence altogether, recognizing a threat endures. So whether it's a kidnapping or whether it's a legitimate terrorist threat plotting against our interests or the homeland, we're not going to see it very clearly, I think, under the current circumstances. and we're going to have extremely diminished capacity in order to respond to it.
How would China develop a presence in Afghanistan with the trust of the Taliban, given their ongoing civil rights abuses against Muslims in China?
Well, unfortunately, the ongoing abuses against Muslims in China do not seem to have resonated very strongly with the broader Muslim world. Pretty much all of whom have seemed willing to turn a blind eye to that in order to partake in the largesse that China appears to offer. And so I think, to go to our earlier discussion, both China and the Taliban are highly transactional. They will see benefits to this relationship. They are not going to look at, the Taliban concern about human rights is fairly limited. And so I think they would see that as an internal Chinese issue, which the Chinese would encourage them to do, and look for whatever kind of payout the Chinese are offering.
I think historically the Chinese have been very predatory about this. Even in Afghanistan, there's a large copper mine in Aniak south of Kabul they've long sought to exploit, but the security situation hasn't enabled them to. I think they'll seek and obtain concessions of all manner from the Taliban and probably use our logistical infrastructure to export those materials now back to China, which has previously been an enormous logistical challenge. We may have helped solve that for them, but I don't think it'll last because, again, the security situation is not likely to persist.
With our enemies now emboldened, can we expect any 20th 9/11 anniversary terror events?
Oh, I think that's absolutely the case, and it needs to be. Yes, getting everybody out is the top priority for today, but for anyone who's not working on that issue, I would hope everyone across DHS, the entire national security apparatus of the United States is focused on that, and that it can come from any direction. Certainly, I think the Taliban would like it to be as symbolic as possible. I'm sure they will celebrate in the U.S. Embassy. But I think the possibility for a spectacular attack, or even a series of small attacks, is another option for them. That rather than go for one that can be defeated, is go for a whole host of little ones that you can't play whack-a-mole with. That there's too much going on, and whether they would target the mainland United States, whether they would target Europe, whether they would target regional assets and facilities. There's just a wide range out there for them, and we know they want to do it. And so I think hopefully the lack of planning and the very dangerous assumptions that informed this decision have been recognized inside the administration, and they are addressing this issue.
I'd add only that, look, they've had the motive, they've lacked the means and opportunity for some time. We've taken a great deal of effort to attack both Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and their affiliates across the world and in the region in particular, and we've had success in suppressing it, and we protected the homeland as a result. I think the victory we have just handed them is unprecedented. I think that they celebrated our withdrawal from Beirut, from Mogadishu, certainly repeated victories at 9/11 itself, but were short-lived because of our response. Again, at this point now, this is the largest sanctuary and the most well-equipped sanctuary that terrorist organizations have ever had, and this as the historic home. And I think the victory over the United States in their minds that they've just achieved is the greatest drive for recruitment and incentive for resuming operations that they could have possibly imagined. And so I think it is now just a matter of when. And so we should certainly be taking all necessary steps to reverse this as quickly as possible, because it's going to endanger U.S. security and already is.
So we covered the weapons left behind, but there are several follow-up questions if either of you wish to address. So under normal circumstances, what are the protocols for destruction of the equipment? Someone read that drones were left behind. So what would that mean if China gets them? Sorry, the other one was also about self-destruct. Is there something about the software that we can self-destruct?
Right. So first, I would say that a lot of this equipment was left in the hands of our partners. So quite intentionally, it was not envisioned as part of the destruction plan. However, I think that certainly under the circumstances, we should have taken steps to establish control measures, dual control measures over depots, consolidated them where necessary, And if under the circumstances of the last few weeks, it probably would have been beneficial to have a presence at the depots to be able to make them, render them unusable. Unfortunately, the withdrawal's pace and the degree of collapse in the Afghan security forces prevented it. Again, our haste, sort of our speed, really tended to create this situation and exacerbate it. In terms of software or other mechanisms that could have been done to disable equipment, the only comment I'll make again is that some of this equipment is so sophisticated that it's difficult for us to maintain. It's going to be very challenging for Afghans, especially the Taliban, to maintain it. In terms of the UAV specifically, I think they're referring to Scan Eagles, which is more or less a commercial off-the-shelf system. It's not something we'd want to have our adversaries in possession of, but it isn't an acute risk. I do think it can and will be used against us. That type of equipment can be exploited by our adversaries and almost certainly will be. And again, I think this points to the fact that were we truly prepared? Did we in fact accelerate to the point in which we accepted so much risk? We now no longer can mitigate it. And I think the facts would bear that we have in fact accepted far too much risk in the pace of our withdrawal.
The only thing I'd add to that, Adam, quickly is I think Rob's point about how our pace of withdrawal and the nature of it accelerated the collapse of the Afghan argument really goes to the heart of the president's argument that, which has been echoed by the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, that we couldn't buy will for the Afghan forces. Well, actually, we had been buying them will for a number of years, and stoking that through our presence and our engagement. And Rob spoke to that earlier. And one of the things I found particularly disturbing about the insistence that it is the cowardice of the Afghan forces that have brought all this to bear is it makes me think again about Vietnam and the way our vets were treated. And one thing I think is incredibly important, I guess we come out of this conflict, is to make sure everybody who served in Afghanistan knows the value of their service, that the country is grateful that the way this has taken place has not undermined that. I think that is a critical point that can't be made too often.
Let's have a quick question, just a couple sentence answer, because it's an important one, then we'll finish up. But should the U.S. and its allies offer military and monetary support to the remaining resistance groups?
I would say my reflexive answer is yes. The challenge, of course, now is we're dependent upon the Taliban, whom they oppose, in order to facilitate the evacuation of our citizens, and that puts us in a set of handcuffs. So I think we'd have to do so very delicately, and I think there are ways in which that could be done.
I concur. We would need a lot more information before we would be able to make an effective run at that.
Gotcha. Fred?
Robert Greenway and Victoria Coates, thank you so much for participating in this extremely informative panel on the crisis in Afghanistan. This is just part of the important work the Center for Security Policy is doing right now on this national security crisis and on many others. And I hope you'll go to our website, securefreedom.org. That is securefreedom.org, to look at the incredible work we're doing on this. And we're going to resume our weekly webinars on a variety of high-profile national security topics next month. I hope you'll join us. I'm going to sign off now, and I'm going to hand it off to Adam to close.
Well, you've covered the important stuff, Fred, but if you enjoy these programs as much as I do, make sure to contribute. As Fred said, securefreedom.org. Click on the big white donate button in the upper right corner. You can make an instant contribution, and you can also get information about other methods of giving. And as Fred mentioned, we will have our full fall schedule coming up. We'll start up right after Labor Day, and I'll be sending out the information about that. So look out for that. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your summer. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.